Welcome to Unlayer, the show where we explore next generation blockchains. I'm your host, Saul, alongside my co host here, Dave. And today we're joined by both Cindy and Chris, co founders of Drift Protocol, the protocol that brings on chain cross margined perpetual futures to Solana. Guys, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yep, great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. I think it would be awesome to start with just maybe a brief background on who you guys are, how the team came together, all that good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I can get started here. Cindy and this is Chris. We're both co-founders of Drift. I came from a trading background. I'm crypto, and Chris, I let you introduce yourself as well. But one of the very early smart contract engineers in Solana. We started Drift about 3 years ago, back in the summer of 2021, in response to the lack of perpetual dexes out there, especially on Solana. We thought that the technology and the speed of Solana would be the best place to host a fast and performant on-chain DEX. So the co-founders actually all met on Twitter. So Chris and I met on Twitter, and the other co-founders in the team, we were working with them in the past. So yeah, we all came together and decided to build out Drift, and then we launched our first product in November of 2021. We grew out V1 over the course of the next couple months, and then that was kind of a pure virtual AMM. We built out the ideas upon which V1 was built in V2, which launched November of last year. So today, we're the largest perpetual DEX in Solana with over 150,000 users to 50 mil TVL. And yeah, doing anywhere between 100 to 200 mil in daily volume. And I can let Chris maybe talk through the design architecture and the motivation behind how V2 is built.
Yeah, so before working on Drift, I was a software engineer at Amazon. And then during COVID, just got crypto pilled and kind of went down the rabbit hole, especially on the dev side. And then, fell in love with Solana tech and community in 2021. We've just been going at it since then. And I think the big thing about our V2 is just having built on Solana for a long time. We really focused on trying to make it as scalable as possible to work with SVM. So probably too technical, but really thinking about how do you parallelize your DEX such that you can like maximize throughput, especially in a high fee regime, kind of like we're in now. So it's definitely we definitely learned a lot from our V1 going into our V2, and yeah, we're pretty happy with how the V2 has been scaling as Solana usage picked up.
Awesome. I think we can get into, I guess, like the differentiation between V2 versus V1, improvements and things like that. Perhaps it'd be useful to start for our listeners on, well, what is a perp? Why should someone trade perps? Let's start there.
Yeah, I can start with this one. So perps are a crypto native invention. They're essentially futures that don't expire and are kept in line with their underlying spot price, with the idea of a funding rate. So the price differential between what the contract is priced at and the underlying spot. So it's essentially a synthetic contract that allows you to take leverage on an underlying asset. So if you have Solana spot, you could have effectively Solana perps that are synthetic but settle to the value of the underlying through charging the traders of the perps a price differential between the price of the contract and the price of the underlying. So as an example, in the past couple of months, the price of Solana perps has been elevated compared to the price of the underlying. There's a lot of demand to buy the underlying and leverage up on the futures contract as well. So yeah, premium on perps have been anywhere between 100 to 200% annualized, at least in Drift. That shows heavy demand for the underlying. Chris, any other way you would describe perps?
I think in addition to what Cindy said, part of the reason why perps have gotten really popular in crypto is we see all these crypto assets like scattered across a bunch of blockchains, a bunch of L2s, etc. And bridging between all these blockchains is like pretty painful. So the nice thing about perps being synthetic is it means that you can trade all these different assets in one place, which reduces a lot of friction for users. So uh, Drift users don't just like trade Solana related assets; they can trade theoretically trade anything, right? Right now, it's more like other Ethereum, Bitcoin type assets as well. So the nice thing about synthetic type instruments is it really opens up what you can trade in one place. Versus if you're just only trading spot, you'd have to migrate around all the different like blockchains. And then the other thing is a lot of people like using perps to be hedging their spot exposure. So someone might want to hold their Solana because they're earning staking, but they're worried about like the price of it going down. They can open up a short perp to hedge their exposure in USD. And with all the basically new like DPIN and AI type assets, we see that being a really popular um, user behavior going forward as users make more money in these like crypto native assets on chain.
Why do you think it is that perps never really came to popularity in TradFi? And I think in TradFi, options are huge. And likewise, why do you think options maybe aren't quite as big in crypto?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Maybe I can start with the second one first. Um,
Mhm.
crypto crypto assets already have huge amounts of volatility, and options are essentially leveraged on volatility itself. Um, I think there's also the element of simplicity of perps, which is that instead of when you trade options, you kind of have to choose between a bunch of different strikes. You have to understand how an options is
Mhm.
priced, and you have to understand and have a view on the underlying volatility of the asset as well, which I think is quite mispriced in crypto. And most people don't understand how to price, the volatility of, let's say, Doge or even something like Solana, which could have like 1,000% annualized volatility, very, very different from traditional assets. So the misunderstanding of volatility makes it difficult for the average retail trader to trade options, whereas perps are really just an expression of our price going to go up or price going to go down. And it's very easy when you break it down to a binary option of just buying or selling. And I think that's the reason that perps have taken off in crypto versus options. I think that the infrastructure of blockchains make it very difficult for there to be proper liquidity on the option side as well, where even with perps, we've struggled a lot with developing liquidity models that work. Thankfully, where there today, liquidity is in a good spot, but imagine having to have market makers for every single strike for an option on chain and forcing them to like liquidate users on chain. So I think that the nature of blockchains make it quite difficult for it to support the complex nature of options. And for the average crypto degen, it's sort of not worth the payoff of having to make all these complex calculations. And the dopamine cycle of longing a perp almost takes care of that already. I think in TradFi there are versions of perps that exist. I guess more like CFDs that are cash settled would probably be the most similar to how the perpetual swap works. But I would say most of those features have taken more form just because, yeah, I think people prefer to trade something that expires in TradFi. But yeah.
I think there's just a lot of path dependence too in TradFi. So perps were created later. I think by an
Mhm.
economist like 10 or 20 years ago, for where futures have been around longer. And futures in TradFi like initially existed to hedge commodities. So it made sense for them to actually be physically settled, which means you need to have that happen somewhat periodically versus like physically
Mhm.
settling digital assets. I think makes less sense. So there's a combination of like the medium of digital assets. It isn't as important to have these like periodically settled futures and then also the path dependence. There's a good book called Trading at the Speed of Light, which kind of goes through the path dependence of like tradfi futures and options. And a lot of it's just like what exists first, and then what gets locked in via regulation ends up being like how everything ends up trading. So perps being like, or crypto being brand new, it gives you like a fresh slate to kind of start with. So it's not, that's why it kind of ends up looking differently, I think.
Can you help us understand how leverage works on Drift? How is it that users can trade, in some cases 5x or in some cases 20x leverage on some of these markets? What pieces kind of need to be in place to make that happen, and what are the risks with all of that?
I could probably take this. I think the main thing is that leverage, it's like kind of not fungible across time, where you can't always offer users the same amount of leverage based on a lot of different factors. So a big difference between V2 and V1 is the leverage that is extended to users is more dynamic. For example, the bigger a user, the less leverage you want to extend them, because if they're very big, it's actually it's harder to liquidate them because their size will move the price. Um, so one concept that Drift has is basically will reduce the initial leverage extended if you're really big, which helps reduce the risk to exchange. There's also the concept of like global leverage caps. So Drift does cross collateral, which means you can borrow against different spot positions, which poses a lot of different risk. So we have the concept of like basically max borrowing power for a given asset. So if the price of the collateral goes up, we basically cap how much leverage gets extended. So those are like two examples of basically you want things to be very dynamic. So if you're always offering 20x leverage, regardless of like the global leverage in the system or how big users are, you can get into trouble.
Maybe to use like a practical example, but I think at the moment on Twitter, have you seen the BonkGuy who put like a 6x long on Bonk when it was super low, and he's got it up to 12, 10, 15 million. How would you have dealt with that if that happened on Drift?
So I think there's a concept of always needing a counterparty to provide the other side of the trade. And that could be via pool or, P2P. In our model, it's peer to pool in a sense, where we have a global pool and per market pool of profit that exists for a position. And this profit allows the user to settle their P&L against. And that's sort of what is is fueling the leverage in a sense, because leverage needs to be created or turned into actual profits via other people's losses, right? So you need to make sure that there's actual P&L or losses in the system given to the protocol in order to realize someone else's profits. So in the past, if you remember the famous BCH halving incident on OKX back in, I think, 2019, they had an issue where there wasn't enough P&L in the system in order to settle huge profits made by people who longed the BCH breakout. So they had to essentially claw back profits from users who had already closed their positions. So this is a pretty bad user experience, where if a user thinks that they have made a certain amount of money, they should be able to take from the exchange. And there's a lot of P&L or risk management practices to help reduce and make sure that there's enough profits in the system. What we do is we have a settled P&L pool where there's an existing pool of P&L per market. And if a user is up by a certain percent, they need to settle against that market. So there needs to, like, the protocol needs to search for a counterparty that's lost money to pay back winners in a sense. In Bybit's case, I'm not sure how that worked. They needed to make sure that, there was that 10 million, 15 million in losses from other counterparties to settle this user. That's how we would have dealt with it.
Yeah, I think the main thing is for that user, One, they won't be able to increase their position based on unrealized P&L. They need to go find a counterparty that they can settle the losses against. And then the second thing is, if they're up really big, they can't withdraw money before settling it. So they can't like basically take money from other users prematurely. So there's very strict accounting of P&L. And you can't let users like prematurely borrow against unrealized P&L, because then that poses a risk to all the depositors in the system. So a lot of it comes down to like really granular accounting and keeping track of like every dollar and not letting dollars be withdrawn unless it's safe to do so.
And then if it all goes horribly wrong, you just withdraw basically from the insurance fund. That's basically the backstop, is it, at the end? Because presumably, as much as you want losses to offset these things, he could theoretically have cashed that out, and you might not have had the losses to offset it. So there is an insurance fund, I believe, in Drift. So is that the idea of the insurance fund?
Yeah, exactly. Each perp market, if there is not enough P&L for the user to withdraw, either if it's, and this is like configurable per perp market, but either the money is pulled from the insurance fund. So for the bigger markets, it'll pull from the insurance fund, and if it's a smaller market that's deemed super risky, basically the losses can be socialized across users, and that enables Drift to list longer tail markets without putting risk on the insurance fund. So it's kind of the extent to which the insurance fund is pulled on is based on like the safety of the asset. But yeah, the insurance fund is there to pay out bankruptcies for like safe markets, and then also for the spot markets as well.
Something unique about Drift is also just the sheer variety of products. You guys have borrow lend markets, insurance funds, delta neutral vaults, counterparty trading. Question here is, what's the strategy behind expanding into all these different product areas? Are they boosting liquidity within the platform?
Yeah, the original thinking with what we've built was, and one of the unique functions of Drift is that we have cross collateral. So you can margin positions with other assets other than USDC. So you can deposit Sol Spot, you can deposit BTC, RAT-E, even assets like Jupiter or Jito on the platform. And how we've enabled this is that we built a backend borrow lend market that supports the cross collateral alongside liquidation system, which enables assets to be liquidated if they can't support the open positions that you have. And that has actually led to a lot of traders choosing Drift over other platforms because they want to hold on to the assets instead of needing to sell into USDC in order to trade a position. So a lot of the products on Drift are actually derivative of that. So we do have a lending market that in the backend actually does support the perpetual program. And we found that actually leads to better liquidity because there are people coming in, depositing SOL, and then using that SOL as collateral to short the SOL perp to create a delta neutral position. And that leads to products where users can also earn yield without taking market views. And I think we wanted to build a all-in-one kind of ecosystem where you can, if you're a passive user, you have products available for you. Our delta neutral vaults are earning anywhere between 30 to 60% APR right now. If you're an active trader, big directional trader, there's something for you. And so our goal is always to kind of build an ecosystem of products where any user can come and interact with the exchange.
And I'd just love to get into how you source liquidity. I mean, I suppose it's the maker side of things, because as I understand it, you've got maybe a three-pronged approach to this. So if you could just go into that, and also how it's been holding up in the bull market.
Yeah, so we Drift Protocol has a virtual AMM, which function as a backstop liquidity. And that's basically collateralized by the protocol's fees that it's making in revenue, as well as users that want to LP into it. And then in addition to that, there's also active market makers that can either place resting limit orders to provide liquidity, or they can provide just-in-time liquidity where they see a user's order and they atomically basically place and fill that order. A big thing we realized is you need active market makers taking on positions because they're good at managing risk. So the virtual AMM tends to have about 1 to 2% of the OI at any time. And we found that is very important for the backstop liquidity, not to have too much inventory. And that happens because there's active market makers taking on positions, and then also funding arbitrageurs taking on positions as well. And when you have these more active players taking on the risk and holding positions, it creates less risk for the overall protocol. So far this bull market, the protocol has done really well. The OI is currently 140 million. Insurance fund is net up. There's been less than 50K in bankruptcies and I think millions of dollars of revenue to that insurance fund. So the interplay between the backstop liquidity owned by the protocol and then the active market makers taking on risk has worked really well so far. And then in terms of scaling, basically Solana is great, fast, and efficient, but it's still a blockchain, so there's limited block space. So one of our theses was that in the full block regime, Solana would converge towards just-in-time liquidity because it relies on less transactions actually being needed to fill users' orders. So even though Drift has a ton of volume, it still takes up a relatively small percentage of the block space. I think recently it's been about 3.5% of the Solana block space, even though it's doing about $200 million in volume a day. So the just-in-time liquidity was really built to basically keep scaling with Solana, because it still is a limited compute environment.
And Cindy, maybe for you, but how has it been to attract the market maker side? Because I believe during the bear market, they all sort of left Solana. And maybe one of the criticisms that I occasionally see about Drift is people saying that maybe there's quite a lot of spread. Like if you put down large positions, it moves the price quite a lot. So how's that been sourcing the liquidity? How does it compare maybe to the big perps dexes on Ethereum?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest struggle was probably in 2023, post FTX, trying to source market makers. I guess the difference between integrating on Drift and integrating on these other perp dexes that have order matching engines that are essentially off-chain is that you have to really go through the nuts and bolts of integrating on Solana and understand all the technical details of integrating on Solana, which is very different from integrating on a centralized exchange or an off-chain order book. So you sort of have to understand how geo bundles work, how priority fees work, and all these things that are unique to Solana. And during the big Solana bear market, no market maker really wanted to make the effort to get through the humps of integrating on Solana, which made it very difficult for us to integrate MMs. And so last year we relied a lot on the virtual AMM liquidity and some folks who are native to the Solana ecosystem. So one individual market maker that goes by the name of Space Monkey was one of our biggest market makers last year, and sort of very early in the space and very familiar with integrating Solana, but not sort of a big institution. So the struggle was actually attracting larger institutions to come in and also take the other side of trade almost last year. That turned around early this year, late December last year, post breakpoint, when Solana prices started doing better, and we attracted a bigger retail audience. So a lot of the complaints actually came around the time of breakpoint last year, where suddenly we were getting huge inflow of users and huge inflow of traders coming in. But there weren't the large institutional audience, large institutional that could take the other side of these trades. So as a result, liquidity was not as good as we would have wanted it to be. And that's when we decided to spin up a maker rewards program, essentially maker points that allowed market makers to earn points in exchange for providing liquidity to the exchange. We designed a program that rewarded three things. The one is just-in-time liquidity. We placed a big focus on having market makers integrate on JIT because we believe that that would be the best way to scale an MM system with Solana. It rewards maker volume that a maker does, and then it also rewarded the liquidity provided on the order book. So with that program, we incentivize market makers to provide liquidity to different parts of the exchange. And since then, honestly, people have had a much better experience with bills. So the liquidity profile on Drift is very different now than a couple months ago. And that was the story of how we got the top market makers in the space to provide liquidity. And the great thing that we see now is that community market makers that are native to Solana are still doing very well, even with the presence of institutional market makers. So it does show that knowledge with Solana and knowledge with the underlying blockchain is somewhat more important than having a huge balance sheet here.
Can you tell us a bit about your users? I think one of the challenges with building in DeFi is certain jurisdictions restrict, what's able to be done. And obviously, crypto and Solana, especially, I think, is certainly pretty US centric, but that's a market that Drift is not available in. Tell us where are your users primarily coming from, and what markets are you guys targeting looking forward?
Yeah. We don't have a dominant region that users are coming from. We also don't typically track this data. So this is like landing page data, we'll say. A lot of our users are coming from mostly Europe and different parts of Asia at the moment. But we don't see a big dominant group of traders, let's say, in Korea or Singapore, Hong Kong, let's say. The one common trend is that a lot of our users are coming from places where there's little perp coverage, so a little way to trade on centralized exchanges. And where you, for instance, in Hong Kong, you have to be an accredited investor in order to even touch trading perps. So yeah, we're finding a lot of users coming from these like pockets. But one big area of expansion for us in the coming couple of years is localization in certain areas that we feel fits the demographic of users who want to trade perps. So places like Korea and Japan are big, where they have a big sort of trading culture, and they're constantly looking to try new innovations in derivatives. I think there's a kind of big obsession with trading in Korea, where college students or high school students are actually trading the Kospi index more than other places in the world. But yeah, as we sort of built towards a more centralized like experience similar to Robinhood, those are the areas that we want to build localized product experiences in that may not look like the current JIT experience, which is very crypto native. So yeah, it's a big kind of product as well as marketing push to get deeper into these regions.
So I think you were mentioning previously about that the order book is fully on chain. DYDX, I think the current instantiation that they've got on the ETH2 certainly doesn't have that. The Cosmos one, I think they're trying to build that, but maybe it's not complete. So, I mean, are you the first guys who have done that? What's the importance of having the order book fully on chain? I mean, it sounds good, it's like, oh, that's fully decentralized, but what's the actual, benefits that anyone's actually receiving at the end of the day? Yeah, be great if you could go into that. Maybe Chris, if you want to answer.
We're not the first to do an order book on chain, so there's other Solana protocols doing similar things, and I'm sure other people have tried it before. I think the main thing about being on chain is it increases censorship resistance. So especially as the protocol gets bigger, it means that the core team can't stop it from going down. So a great thing about Drift is a lot of the community members run keeper bots and maker bots and basically all this infrastructure to keep it going. And there's incentives built into the protocol, so that keeps happening. So this basically means that traders don't need to rely on the core Drift contributors to keep a service running all the time in order to keep trading. And especially as you look at the long term view of decentralization, spinning up different UIs and basically maintaining it as we move towards having a DAO and further decentralization is really important that that censorship resistance is there. Um, so we basically try to put as much on chain as possible so that like the core Drift contributors don't have to like maintain and keep it running, which we think is really important to keep scaling decentralized perps.
I had a couple questions actually, just on the user experience front, the product front. So one is, what's your view on just how lots and lots of retail users will interface with DeFi protocols? Whether it's a Drift or a Jupiter or what have you. I think in previous bull runs we saw a large volume of users swapping, for instance, through things like MetaMask and Phantom, and that's kind of what drove those businesses to be really valuable from a revenue generation standpoint. I'm skeptical of the view that retail in the next bull run or mainstream users will kind of use 20 DeFi protocols, front ends, and somehow manage all of that. I feel like there is going to be some aggregation at the UX layer, but I'm wondering, is that something you guys are positioning yourselves for? Are you building kind of API products in the back end as well, similar to what Jupiter does, where basically everyone can kind of integrate with them and either use their front end or use their back end?
Yeah, I can get started here. One of the things that we're working on is constantly simplifying the user experience. I think if you look at Drift today, the average person outside of crypto will be like, "What is all this? Like, this is insane. I have no idea what's going on." Obviously, if you're a pro trader or if you're familiar with DeFi, this will look familiar to you. But I agree that if we're actually looking to scale beyond current set of DeFi users, it's going to take a lot of abstraction. And I think that's why wallet apps and aggregators have done so well. So Jupiter is obviously an example of this that abstracts away all of the order book liquidity underlying and just creates this very simple swap button for you. That's where we're heading, and that's where we think we want to go. Even with Perps being such a complex product, we think that it can be simplified and made a lot easier. So in the next couple of weeks, we're actually launching a light mode that abstracts a lot of the difficulty of opening up a position, and looks like a very simple button, just like how much do you want to long, how much do you want to short. This is your market price that you're going to be entering at, and that's as simple as it goes. Outside of that, we are working with operators of Telegram bots that have been very popular abstraction of DeFi trading to provide perps as an experience to Telegram traders as well. So if you can imagine a slash buy $100,000 worth of Sol perp happening within Telegram itself, that's where we're kind of moving the experience. And then I think there's an interesting experience to talk about with maybe having perps be built in within a wallet as well. That might, that's probably a bigger regulatory question, but I do think it's an interesting abstraction that we will probably spend a lot of time to explore in the coming couple of months.
And can we elaborate a bit on, because I'm curious about this example you brought up, Telegram bots. Obviously, they've been really popular since last summer, the rise of Unibot. And I think for swapping, there's not much to show the user. They go from one token to another, and then they have a balance, and it has some price. I'm wondering, for a UI standpoint, because what you're alluding to is kind of this composable UI where you're kind of adjusting it to be in the context of a chat interface. what information do you show users? Obviously, I don't think it's going to be very easy to chart in that kind of interface, or maybe it is. How are people experiencing this, using it, managing it? What information do they need to see and keep tabs of for this?
Yeah. I think it's really just mark price, and you can kind of have a chart tab open and another tab similar to how degens see the current price, and then they have a bird eye chart in the background or on their menu tabs. So yeah, that's
Sure.
sort of the experience that we want to abstract to. It's like users can have access to as much information as they need, but the real information is really just what's the price that you're getting at, and how much are you willing to sort of pay in slippage to get into that position.
And Chris, maybe back for you, but I think at the moment, potentially the biggest competition that you've got on Solana is from Jupiter's perps themselves. Obviously, it's a different model, but it'd be great if you could try and describe what the differences would be and why someone would choose one over the other.
I think the main differentiation between something like Drift and Jupiter is the Jupiter GMX style perps are basically backed by spot, so it kind of limits what you can actually trade, especially on Solana. So the way we see Drift really differentiated is in the long tail market listings. So there's a wider selection of markets that you can trade. For example, Drift has pre-launch markets coming out soon, which lets you trade on tokens that aren't even listed yet. So W Perp is coming out, Camino Perp coming out before the token even exists. So that's stuff like that is really hard to do in the GMX model. And then the other thing is Drift being cross collateral offers really interesting ways to express a view on markets. So we have things like GTO listed, render listed, etc. So we see as Solana becomes this like hub for DePIN and AI assets and other like crypto native assets, Drift is the CME of sorts for those like long tail of assets. And I think it's just difficult to make that work in a GMX style model. So we see that as Drift's real edge. I think a good thing with the GMX style model for Jupiter is that it does make it easier to offer like larger leverage. GMX and Jupiter can do like 100x BTC and Sol leverage, which is a little bit tougher in Drift style model. So I think it'll end up appealing to a different type of user than what Drift is offering with like longer tail markets and more crypto native assets, but less leverage just based on the model.
Yeah, that does actually make it a lot more clearer in my head about what the big differences are, because I always understood that, fundamentally under the hood something was happening, but not what that actually meant for the end user. So that does make it a lot clearer. Yeah, I love this idea of the perps pre-tokens, because obviously you've got Whale's market at the moment, which is allowing you to effectively buy someone else's tokens almost in a spot fashion before they've actually launched. It's a big launch that you've got coming up. How do you see it going? Is it the first one in the industry? Yeah, just any thoughts you have on it?
It's not the first in the industry, but it's the first on Solana. So we're going to be launching in a couple of days, and pretty excited to give Solana users the chance to buy or sell a token before it's listed, just to kind of be able to express their views in a sense. Yeah, these contracts typically don't see a lot of volume, so we're not expecting huge amounts of volume to come through. It's really a couple of things. Like one, it serves as a reference point for people looking to price these assets ahead of time, ahead of the launch, and it also just allows for speculative behavior on how much is my airdrop worth, and how much is my claim going to be worth at some point, which is pretty useful to degens out there. So yeah, expecting it to go very well. We're going to do the same for a lot of the Solana native projects, such as the Camino, MarginFi, Tensor, who have yet to launch tokens. So we're pretty excited to be the hub of these pre-listed tokens on Solana.
And presumably you could hedge maybe the allocation that you're going to get. if you did a perp short on it.
Exactly. Yep. That's the right idea.
So obviously you've decided to launch on Solana. DYDX is doing their own app chain. Often app chains, one of the best use cases that people mention is perps, because you can generally just transfer USDC over from any chain. So what do you feel are the big advantages for launching on a general purpose chain, where you've already said that it's slightly limited with the block space? So yeah, just be good to get into that.
Yeah, I think one thing is what makes Drift unique is the cross collateral. So having a bunch of different spots assets that you can trade with. So in addition to USDC, there's Sol, there's LSTs, there's even the Solana native assets like Render, Jito, Jupiter, even the meme coins like WIF. And I think basically embedding Drift as the core derivatives primitive inside of Solana gives it a really unique niche. We think there's going to be this crypto economy on top of Solana with all these crypto native assets, and it's going to be very natural to deposit the spot assets into Drift and hedge them and then express a view on those assets going forward. So versus basically the proliferation of app chains and perps, they're all very similar, where you're kind of trading the crypto majors using USDC based perps. I think it's harder to differentiate in that context versus developing that basically CME for crypto native assets on Solana. I think can be a really unique position for Drift in the long run.
One thing you've mentioned before on Twitter, Cindy, is this idea, or I guess you've highlighted kind of the massive growth in TVL. That's always been a bit of a metric some people call into question, whether it actually measures anything useful. I think certainly after the Solana kind of really got a lot of traction in the past, or Q4 of last year, many users were flocking to DeFi protocols in anticipation of potential future airdrops and are doing whatever they can to, catch the next Cheetos, so to speak. But you put out a thread on how you believe Drift's rise in TVL is sticky and it's actually productive. Can you kind of elaborate a bit more on your thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of DeFi protocols that talk about TVL as a metric typically just focus on kind of the borrowland aspect of it, where you're depositing an asset and perhaps you're borrowing against it. Drift kind of goes beyond that by allowing other use cases for the assets that are stored on an exchange. And I think utilization is more important than TVL in a sense, because you can have, billions of dollars sitting in a protocol that's locked and not doing anything, versus assets that are generating yield or generating trading activity or doing some sort of structured product action. So one example of like diverging to blast, let's say over the last couple of months, caught a lot of flack recently because that TBL was essentially non-productive, wasn't really doing anything, and just helping users to earn points essentially. Whereas where we came from, people deposited into the protocol in order to either trade, find leverage, or deposit into products that are actually earning real yield, not just pure tokens or farming points. So that's what we mean by productive TVL. And I think another way of looking at the metrics is looking at ratios like volume to TVL or TVL to open interest. In our view, actually, open interest is probably the more important metric to look at, because it looks at the sum of open positions on a blockchain. Well, not blockchain, but at the app. Right now, as Chris mentioned, we're at about 150 mil OI, and that shows you that actually there's a large percentage of that TVL going into open positions and users using that collateral to use to trade. So yeah, looking at TVL as a standalone is probably not as helpful as looking at TVL against another metric on the exchange.
And then maybe looking forward, and it'd be interesting to get perhaps both of your views, but how do you see the end game really for Drift in terms of additional products, in terms of maybe volumes? Yeah, how would you like to see it go over the next 2, 5, 10 years?
So I think we said somewhere in the podcast last year that we wanted to take on Binance in a matter of years. We want to be on a path of decentralization in order to get to the centralized exchange performance, as well as to make sure that we continue to be accessible to users all over the world. So yeah, one of the big goals and North Stars for us is to get to the level of 30 million users that we see on Binance today. We have a long way to go until we get there, but a lot of the path and the internal metrics that we have is to continue to push towards an experience that rivals centralized exchanges without compromising on decentralization. And this is not necessarily going to be the same path and same playbook that centralized exchanges and Binance has taken. I think our path will be very different, focusing instead on building and incentivizing different front ends, different types of user experiences that are available to users, to continue to essentially target different audiences with like different types of products. So simplified user experience for users that are not as familiar as DeFi, pro trader experiences for the groups of traders that want that experience, and having all of these products all settle to the same app and smart contracts on Solana. That's sort of our vision for getting there. A lot of that will be powered by decentralization. So having the community own the protocol, own and be able to contribute to it is going to be critical on our mission to get to the biggest exchange in crypto, without a centralization risk.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's important for us to keep scaling the technology. So looking ahead to Fire Dancer and Solana continuing to grow, I think you see like this crypto economy merge on top of Solana, and I think Drift can end up being the core DeFi derivatives protocol that basically all these different crypto assets and teams can use to hedge their exposure and just to trade on. And I think out of that comes kind of what Cindy says. There's a bunch of different type of UIs and ways to interact with that protocol. But fundamentally, it's supporting like the Solana crypto economy. So I kind of envision Drift becoming the CME for crypto native assets that are hosted on Solana, and that kind of being our niche and how we continue to grow.
Yeah, because often the swap function that you get with things like Jupiter, that often gets integrated into loads of games, into loads of different applications as like a financial substrate. And yeah, it'd be interesting if Perps can also sort of take on that role. For example, deep in, you're receiving, fees in render token or whatever it may be. And if you just had an instant, delta neutral hedge option, basically just something super simplified, but to start making Perps more of a financial substrate that you see across maybe games and things like that. Yeah, I think that'd be an awesome future.
Yeah, I think you want to be able to support the people who want to trade meme coins like Bonk or WIF, but then you also want to be able to support the more like technical team that's just trying to hedge their deep in AI exposure. And we kind of see Drift as that core derivative protocol / primitive that can facilitate that in the long run.
Awesome. I think we covered a good variety of topics here with respect to Drift. Are there any closing topics or things you guys want to cover? V2 is out. What should people be excited about in the near term future?
Yeah, I think as we wrap out a points program, I'm excited to start embarking more on decentralization paths. So going to be a lot of ways for the community to get involved in governing, stewarding, and owning the protocol. So yeah, look out for a bunch of announcements there. Pre-listing is going to be really big, and we'll let you guys know when Light UI is out as well. It's going to be important in bringing a big amount of users in. And then going beyond that, we're excited to potentially look at branching out of perps, going more into spot territory as well. Just using our current technology that we've built with just-in-time liquidity to go in that direction.
Awesome. Well, a lot to look forward to. Sydney and Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to join us during these chaotic markets.
Thank you guys so much for having us. This was super fun.
Thank you.